Welcome to The Writer's Block, a podcast for writers by writers, providing you with a great resource and community. Here are your hosts, Abel, Amber, and Julie.
Hello everyone and welcome back to The Writer's Block. Today we are recording episode 6 of The Writer's Block, and today we're going to be talking about coming up with story ideas. The moderator for the show is Amber, so the YouTube video will be on her channel. Amber, you want to take it away and get us going with today's topic?
Yes, thank you. Okay, so today I wanted to talk about how to come up with your story ideas. Every single time you ask a writer or an author, where do you get your story ideas? You will hear a different answer every single time. So I just kind of wanted to come and bring it to you guys, and we can have a conversation about where some of your story ideas have come from, and or maybe even where you wished they came from. So you want to go ahead and take it first, Julie?
Sure. So I think it's really funny. You're like, you get a different answer every time. Usually it's like, what's your story about? And that they go,
It's like, I don't know.
I don't know. Don't make me talk about it. Don't make me talk about it. That was like the first thing that came to mind. So for me, I think my stories come from a ton of different places, especially with Shoot Down the Wendy Bird. It was flash fiction and poetry, which was all pretty much photo inspiration. So I collected a whole bunch of different short story prompts and pictures, and then I wrote stories based off of those. And then when it comes to novels, I've had dreams that I wake up in the middle of the night and write down notes for. I've had inspiration from other stories that I really liked and wanting to merge two different stories that I had and put my own separate twist on it, or like reading something and being like, I would have done this with it. How could I make this my own? And sometimes it's just the mood that I'm in. Like different stories call to me, different characters call to me based on the mood that I'm in. So I feel like for most creative people, you get inspiration from so many different places that it's hard to pinpoint it, at least for me, to like one specific thing.
Yeah.
What about you, Abel?
I'll tell you, some of my, like, the stories that I've written already have come from a cross of books that I read usually. Like, I'm like, what if this world met this world and this may have happened instead of this? So my first book, Southern Secrets, it was really inspired by Beautiful Creatures and The Immortal Instruments. And it's like, I like all of the different characters. I'm like the different kinds of creatures in The Immortal Instruments. And then I like the whole witches thing in Beautiful Creatures. And so I was like, well, I'm going to kind of create that where the witches in Beautiful Creatures could like, they could like manipulate like the different elements and stuff. And so I made my, not necessarily witches, but a character like the Fae in my story can manipulate different types of elements. And so I just stole little pieces and kind of made it my own. And I'm always interested, like, if a story is written about a girl, I'm always like, so what if the guy's point of view, or what if, and so that's where I get some of my basic ideas from. Also, some others I think I read to you last time off air, like a weird dream that I had at 3:12 a.m. one night, and it was literally a dream, and it was just like weird notes, and all this stuff happened, and I saw all these characters' faces, and that's only happened to me twice, but that's a story that I'm interested in just because I'm like, why did I have that dream? But yeah, I think it's just a mixture of things. I think it's really based on what I read or what I watch, and I always want to know, like, well, what if this would have happened, or what if the evil person would have won that fight, or so that's really what I kind of where I get my inspiration from and I draw from.
Yeah, it's actually funny because I took a writing class in college, and my professor had said that 75% of story ideas start with a what if statement. So you see something, you're like, oh, but what if this happened? And that sparks an idea to write it, which that's only happened to me once whenever I read Dracula by Bram Stoker. I was like, but what if this was from Dracula's point of view? And that's where I came up with one story idea. I've had some where I've dreamed it. And I've even taken multiple dreams and kind of smashed them together to make a new story. But one thing that I did want to ask you guys about was Stephen King has said that once you open your mind up to looking for a story idea, that you will start to see story ideas everywhere. And that one time he went to a junkyard where this dog like tried to attack him, and that's how he came up with Cujo. So has anything in real life sparked an idea for you, either of you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I've had real life things that have definitely influenced some of the short stories that were in my book. And then I also have a darker contemporary that I'm working on now that has a lot of real life kind of little bits and pieces to it. And I think that sometimes, especially when I'm struggling with stories or with writing or feeling inspired or successful as a writer, I think pulling on what came from real life and what I know best, and then using that as like a source of writing inspiration kind of feels like the safest. So sometimes that's what I'll go to too when I'm just feeling like I'm questioning my fantasy books. I'm going to go to like a dark contemporary that I can pull from like real life experiences with, and then know that I can kind of get that covered without having to like make up anything too crazy. So I think that pulling from your own life, and I think Amber, you said too, like they always say that the author's first work is their most like autobiographical. They put the most of themselves into characters. It's because it's natural. Like, you know it, you can't get it wrong because you know it. So I think pulling from your life and what you see around you is second nature.
That is funny because the people that know me and read my first book, everyone could tell like this is Abel because of the language used and the way it's used, and certain characters are very, snappy, and I'm kind of like that, and everyone's like, oh my god, like if I like they're just crazy because it's different characters, but they all come from me. So it's funny you say that. From drawing from real life, I don't know that. I don't think that I intend to do it, but I think it kind of happens naturally. I think that maybe not an idea for a whole story, but I think maybe for a scene or something that I'm writing, I envision something I may have seen or somewhere I may have been on vacation. I'm like, oh, that looks really good. Like, I remember when I was in Portland, Oregon, and just the vibe there, and I just pictured all of these characters. Like, there's a whole street literally of just coffee shops, and you go coffee shop to coffee shop, and like everyone there was very creative, and I saw some characters that I have. It's like a very loose. It's not. I don't really have an idea for the story, but I have characters in mind for it, and I saw them there planning out a movie they're going to make in my head, and it's just I think just being around other creative people, I kind of picked up on that and what they were doing, and I was like, man, that would be really good. And it kind of goes back to what if I had a character that was doing this, and and I drew it from real life because it's somewhere I've seen, and I can remember the smell, and I remember the weather, I remember what it felt like, so it's gonna be very easy for me once I get there to write it out, because I feel like I'm just gonna, and just think about it, I could smell all the different coffees and the different different just house brews, and I think that pulling from real life, I think once I get to that story, whenever that happens, I'm pretty excited for that, because I could just I could feel it.
Yeah, and that'll actually go right into my next question for you guys. But as far as for me with the real world inspiration, it's not necessarily, I don't necessarily get sparked an idea from something that happens to me in real life, but more as things that I'm obsessed with in real life that maybe have never actually happened to me. For instance, I've always been obsessed with, Greek mythology, but I'm very obsessed with Irish culture. So I looked up Irish mythology and created a whole series of stories based around Irish mythology rather than Greek, like how it kind of correlates with Greek mythology. And then also I've always been obsessed with New York City. So most of my stories have been set in New York City. Not as much anymore now that I've been there, because I know that what I was writing was not actually accurate to New York City. But my next question that I wanted to have was, whenever you're sparked a story idea, are you sparked more from a plotted story idea or a character that you want to write a story around? Julie?
That's so hard for me to answer. I think that all of my stories are incredibly, incredibly character-based. So it definitely comes from a character place first, but I think that I always try to have a strong, like, I'm very, very new to the whole, like, pantsing thing, which I know we'll get into in a future episode, but I was very much a plotter. So I had to know basic plot points, but I knew exactly which character in my head belonged in that plot, So I think it's like a weird combination of both. I have to have a plot, but then once I do, I know exactly who belongs in that story.
What about you, Abel?
Mine mainly again would probably be characters, but because I read a story, I want to fall in love with the characters first. I think that's why I had a hard time reading Leigh Bardugo, because she introduces you to a lot of characters right away, and like I am kind of expected to know them right away, and I don't, and I'm like, I don't understand, because I hadn't been introduced to the world or anything. And so I'm like, in Six of Crows, I'm like, I don't understand anything that's happening. I don't like care about these characters yet, and I know, but it was just so much for me to take in, and there's all these different characters right away, and then I had no idea what the story was about. So I'm like, I have nothing to grasp onto here, and so I didn't have a chance to build a relationship with the characters. And so I am very character driven. I feel like characters, if you like the character, you'll like the story. But in my next, I'm kind of anxious because the next story that I plan to write in, I don't know when, whenever I get to it, I actually came up with the story idea first, and then I'm like, okay, I know what I want the story to be about. It's going to be kind of about sirens. Now who are my characters? What are they going to do? Why are they going to do it? And so it's going to be different for me.
Yeah, so if you guys are just listening to the audio and not watching the video, you're missing out on some gems, like Julie stabbing herself in the heart.
Yeah.
Abel saying he had a problem with Leigh Bardugo's writing. But in other words, I actually think that I'm more sparked by plot ideas first, and then I kind of work my characters around it. My Dracula story, of course, was the opposite. I was sparked by the idea of this character, and then drew a plot around him. And actually, he turned into a whole different thing, that would actually be a good episode later. Okay, so let's say I have now a little bit of a scenario for you guys to think over and answer. So let's say you get a great idea, it sparks in your head, you dream it, you see it, whatever happens. How do you know, and how do you figure out if that's good for a poem, a short story, a novel? Like, how does it actually turn into a full-fledged? Because, I can have a story idea that doesn't necessarily mean that arc of that story is enough to take over a whole novel. So how do you then come up with the rest of it to make a full arching story? See, I told you it was good.
I can answer really quickly if you don't.
Go ahead.
And we have another topic later on this year that we're going to kind of get into this even more. And it's going to talk about standalones versus series, so it's very similar to the question. But I'll tell you that for me, if I have an idea, it has to be developed into some kind of story for me, because I don't write short stories, or I don't write, flash fiction. I don't write poems. For me, my only outlet would be writing. So if I don't have enough for a story for a, like a book, then I probably wouldn't be able to go with it. And that's just my personal thing, just because I can't do, I don't want to say I can't, because I'm sure if I tried, I could. That doesn't interest me to do that.
So I think for me, the big determining factor is whether or not I think it's more interesting to take. I've always viewed my flash fiction as a snapshot, like as a photograph, and I'm only explaining that photograph. I'm not explaining what happened a second before the flash went off or a second after the flash went off. I'm only describing that picture. So if my idea seems like it would be more compelling and more gripping in that one condensed second versus, telling the whole like before and after and the whole arc of it, sometimes it's so much more powerful if you leave somebody guessing, like, how the heck did they get there? What the heck happened after that? It's like, I don't know. Like, that's for you to fill in. So for me, it's really about like my excitement over, do I really want to leave a little bit to the imagination and kind of really try to challenge myself to work within that 1 second? Or do I want to like spend enough time with it to flesh it out and make it like a full-fledged story? And that's kind of how I decide exactly what kind of writing goes with each idea, I guess. Yeah,
so for me, it's kind of the same thing. What I do is kind of think about the story idea that I get, and I think, could I create enough conflict around this idea to measure through a book, because a book is nothing but conflict resolution. And if what I've thought of, like, let's say, a guy gets in a car accident and he is now in a wheelchair and his girlfriend breaks up with him, is there enough there that it could cause a lot of conflict? Well, yeah, because I could do like what caused the accident, what kind of background. You could turn that into a full-fledged story. All right, and before we continue, here is a message from one of our sister podcasts.
Hey, Writer's Block listeners, this is Kat and Butch from the Cloak and Dagger podcast, where we talk about all things related to Marvel's Cloak and Dagger.
Yes, I am the know-it-all Cloak and Dagger expert, and Kat's the actual talent on the show. If you're having writer's block, don't forget to tune in to the first season of Cloak and Dagger on Freeform. We'll be right there with you with weekly recap and reaction episodes on our podcast.
While the first episode of Cloak and Dagger premieres on June 7th, the first 2 episodes of our podcast are out now, so be sure to check us out on YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, CastBox, pretty much anywhere you can find podcast audio. And also make sure you follow us on Twitter. We'd love to hear from you guys.
Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite platform. Your support and interaction is always appreciated.
Especially if you're a comic book lover.
And who doesn't like comic books? Those have writers too, right?
Exactly.
The Cloak and Dagger podcast, out now.
Until next time, guys, this has been Kat and Butch. Enjoy the rest of the podcast.
Welcome back. So I hope you guys are enjoying this Finding Your Story ideas. But I actually have another question, and that is, how do you know if your story idea shouldn't be turned into a story? How do you deal with that? Anybody?
That's a tough one. That's a tough one, because I think as creative people, we have a ton of ideas, right? Like, we have a whole bunch of stuff come into our head and we're like, how about this? How about that? All right. So for me, I think I know when a story idea is valid versus needing to be scrapped when it comes to me and I jot it down, or, usually when ideas come to me, like, I'll keep a notebook and I'll just put down all my ideas, or I'll have something in my head or in my phone app, my note app. If I never come back to it, if I never think about it again, if it doesn't keep me up at night, if the characters I haven't already kind of placed in that plot, if they're not speaking to me and kind of begging to be written, then that's probably one that I can ignore. I can always come back to that list of ideas when I'm feeling the need for like inspiration. But if the idea comes and goes and I never go back to it, then that's not one that needs my attention right now. So for me, it's a pretty easy deciding factor. Like, if it doesn't speak to me and call to me, if I don't immediately want to sit down and get to know this plot and these characters better, I can let it go.
Same. The story I was talking about, actually, the whole siren thing, I wanted to actually write a siren story for a long time, just because I've always found their, mythology of them really interesting. And I wanted to write it in my own way. But for the longest time, I thought of the idea and I was just like not that excited about it, so I just kept putting it off. I'm like, whatever. And finally I am like, okay, I'm ready to. Like, I envisioned the characters a little bit. I actually have them, like, I called it casting characters, and I actually have them casted. Like, this is the first time I'm trying to plot a book, and so I've picked like different actors, like who would play this if it was a movie. And so like I see them now and I'm like, oh my god, this is gonna be so good. But yeah, it's been in the past the same way. If I'm not really excited about an idea, I'll pass on it, or I'll wait. And usually if the idea is good enough, it's going to come back around. Like the whole siren thing for me, it's come back around. And I'm like, okay, this is what I want to do. Like, I even have the first 2 or 3 books titled and I don't even know what the hell they're about. But in my head, I know the titles of them. I'm like, this is what it's going to be titled.
Yeah, with me, I think it's the same, right? But the problem is I have actually tried to write a book based on an idea that I ended up thinking, is this even a good idea? And I've tried to write it probably 2 or 3 times. One time I got all the way up to maybe 30,000 words into it and still put it down because I wasn't feeling it. I think at the time maybe what I was reading was affecting what I was writing, because it started out as a story about a girl that figures out that she can see ghosts, and the ghost of her ex-boyfriend that died in high school starts coming to her. and suddenly it turned into a love story between her and this other person, and the ghost just kind of quit coming. And so I think it's the fact that I was in like a romance reading phase, and it tried to turn into a romance. So maybe one day I'll try to rewrite that. But have you guys ever actually tried to expand on an idea, and then halfway through we're like, I don't even think this is a good idea anymore? I see you nodding, Julie. So
Yes.
Thankfully, not for me, because if I was 30,000 words in a book for a young adult book, that's almost done. And so if I was that far into a book, I'd be like, kill me now.
Take me now.
I'd be like, I'm figuring this shit out. Like, we're not leaving here. Like, I would figure it out. Like, yeah.
Well, luckily mine was not that catastrophic. Mine was more along the lines of when I was sharing my short stories and my flash fiction, and I was sharing them on my blog. And people would always comment and say, I need more. I need to know what happened after this. I need to know, like, you can't leave it there. And I think that's the beauty of flash fiction in and of itself. But I would feel bad. So I would sit down and I would go to flesh out these stories and do like a part 2, or see if I did want to make it like a full complete story. And it never felt right. Like I knew that when I stopped that story, that's where that story ended. And once I put it down and published it and like on the blog, and I had it done in my eyes, I could never go back and continue. There was one instance where I did continue and I did 3 parts of story because that shit when I stopped after 1. And I did like a 3-part little flash fiction series. Other than that, it didn't work for me. Like no amount of people wanting more of these characters, I couldn't make it happen. So luckily it was not 30,000 words. It was a flash fiction that I just knew had to stop when it stopped. But yeah, there's been a lot of times where I'm like, this is not going to work.
So that's all the questions that I had about story ideas. Is there anything that you guys want to add about how you come up with story ideas, or how to know a story idea is a good story idea that you might want to add in for our listeners?
I think don't ever be like ashamed or feel like it's cheating to go and look for prompt information. Like there are so many writing prompts online. There's a ton of sources for picture inspiration or writing prompts or different things to kind of get your creativity flowing. So if you're really kind of in a standstill for an idea, even if it's for a scene within a book, go look at some prompts, because sometimes when you get like stuck on something, like a great idea is out there. Like don't be afraid to adapt somebody else's to make it your own, or to look at prompts. Like that's not cheating. It's not being unoriginal. Like you're going to put your own spin on it. So don't be afraid to do those things.
Yeah, and I would say kind of similar. There is really at this point in time, there's no such thing as an original idea. You can make a vampire story an original idea, but there is no really, you know what I mean? Like you'll never be able to create the one story that has never been written before, because somebody somewhere will always compare it to something else. But the whole thing is that it's going to be your vampire story. So your vampire story is different from someone else's. It's just, don't beat yourself up if someone ever compares your work, or if you're like, well, it's too much like this, and you're worried and you don't want to put it out because you're afraid of that. Just shake it off, because like I said, my story was very deeply inspired by Beautiful Creatures and The Mortal Instruments, but it's still my story and it still is different. But people could easily say like, oh yeah, I see the influence of the, and that's all it is. It's influence, and it's, an idea that you just spin and you put your own words into it. And like we've said earlier, people that know you, especially probably if it's your first book, they're gonna be able to tell it's really you, because you put yourself in it, whether you like it or not, even if it's fiction. So I don't beat yourself up over the idea that there is, you have to have the one brand new thing, because at this point in TV, like look at TV, everything's being reused and brought back and recycled. And don't be afraid, because that your story, no matter what, will be unique because it's yours. So just remember that.
Yeah. The last piece of advice that I would have is to find people in your life that you can bounce ideas off of. Some should also be writers, but some should not be writers, because sometimes a non-writer will kind of be like, oh, but I don't know this and that, and they'll actually spark really great ideas for you. But writers kind of know better what makes good ideas, so have more than one person you can bounce your ideas off of. But that's all I've got. I'm spent. It's all I've got.
All right. Join us next time where it's going to be Julie's video, and we'll be talking about getting to know your characters and some character mapping. So join us in a couple of weeks when we have that episode for you guys. Thank you for listening.
You don't want to miss it.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to the Writer's Block, and we'll talk to you in a couple of weeks.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the Writer's Block. We hope you'll join us for our next show. And until then, remember, it's perfectly okay to write garbage as long as you edit brilliantly.